Platformers are generally considered to be the most simple kind of game that can be made. And while that is completely true, that doesn't make them uninteresting to talk about. Platforming in general is also a very wide-ranging topic. Plenty of games have platforming mechanics, even if they're not technically platformers. In real life, we have gravity, leg muscles, and Newton's third law of motion, all of which allow us to do this. Pretty simple stuff as long as you're not a physicist or something. But when it comes to game development, it's not that simple, and we do sometimes have to do a little bit of physics to achieve our goals. It's unfortunate, I know, but it just has to be done. I've said this before, but a large part of game development is just faking things as convincingly and efficiently as possible with the tools that you have available to you. So with that in mind, how does an average platformer's player controller work? It's mostly the same in 2D and 3D. The only difference is, of course, an additional axis and a lot more math, but the core concepts are pretty much identical, so I'm going to be mostly talking about it from a 2D context. All right, so what's the most important thing in a platformer? Jumping. What's the most important part of jumping? Being on the floor. Because if we just increase the player's vertical velocity every time they press the jump button without checking if they're actually on the ground or not, so the game needs to know when the player is on the floor. Collision is kind of a black box, but in most game engines, you don't really need to know exactly how it works to be able to use it as the tool that it is, unless you're like raw dogging Java or Python or something. So we need to use it to make sure that the player doesn't just blast off into space whenever they want to jump. Before we talk about that though, there's a few simpler ways that someone might come up with to deal with this issue. A beginner programmer might say, okay, jumping takes a certain amount of time, so if I just start a timer whenever I jump and then only let myself jump again after that timer ends, that should fix the problem, right? No. For one, if you ever want to change the jump strength or height, you'd also have to change that timer, which is just really inconvenient. And also if you're jumping up to a different height or down to a different height, then the jump is going to take a different amount of time. So this method pretty much immediately falls apart. Another way that's much better but still not the best is using what's called a raycast. A raycast is basically a laser pointer which you can point anywhere and it'll tell you the first thing that it collides with. So if we attach the laser pointer to the character and make it stick out just under its feet, we can have it tell us when it's touching the floor, allowing us to jump. And this does totally work, but it's a little overcomplicated and not as precise as it could be. And it could lead to problems on slopes or weird terrain. So going back to collision, the way that pretty much every game does it is by checking the normal vector of what the player is colliding with. I talked about this a little bit more in depth in my video about graphics, but a normal vector is basically the direction that any face of a 3D mesh is pointing in. So for example, if we check the normal vector of a face that we're colliding with and it's pointing roughly upwards, we know that we're standing on the floor. If we check it and it's facing sideways, we know that we're probably on a wall. And if it's facing down, we're probably stuck to the ceiling somehow. And that sounds a little complicated, but there is a function in Godot that does exactly this. Unity also kind of maybe does, but it sounds like it can be kind of inconsistent sometimes, and you also have to download a package to use it. I don't know, man, Unity sucks. I'm just gonna start a running counter of all the wins Godot has over Unity throughout all of my videos. It's gonna start at 2 because Unity doesn't have a timer component for some reason, which means that you have to code your own timer using the amount of time that's passed between each frame, which is like not hard at all, but it's just really inconvenient, and it would make a lot more sense if Unity just had a timer component like Godot does. Anyways, it's very off topic, but yeah, most games determine if the player is on the ground or not by using collision normal detection. Another thing that we have in real life that game engines only kind of have is friction. I say kind of because physics in game engines is sort of split into a couple different categories. And these categories have different properties and uses depending on how you need the object to behave. The simplest two are static bodies and rigid bodies. Static bodies are generally used for floors, walls, as the name implies, anything that's static and isn't gonna move. Rigid bodies act how you would expect something that's affected by physics to act. They fall, they collide with other physics bodies, they bounce, and they have friction, and they just, you know, they do physics stuff. Soft bodies are like rigid bodies, but if they were soft, this is usually only used for stuff like actual cloth physics. The much more complicated and arguably most important one is called a kinematic body. This is what most player characters are made of, and it's basically a compromise between a static body and a rigid body, in the sense that it can act like a rigid body, but you need to code all of that behavior in yourself. It just gives you all the functions and variables that you need to do so. This is why I said that game engines only kind of have friction. Rigid bodies have pretty easy to set up friction behavior, but kinematic ones take a little bit more work, in exchange for having more control over how they move. So it's pretty easy to set up a kinematic body to have basic movement controls. All you really have to do is set its velocity variable every frame, depending on what buttons are being pressed. You can do the same with rigid bodies, but it'll interfere with the behavior that's already there, which is why it's best to start with a sort of blankish slate that is kinematic bodies. If we want to make a bit more of a complicated and fluid feeling character controller, we'll have to do a little bit more programming and a little bit more physics equations. The main thing that a simple character controller like this is missing is friction, like I said before, and acceleration. This is basically just how long it takes for the character to stop and how long it takes for them to get up to full speed. So velocity is a vector, which is a combination of direction and speed. A vector can be represented in a couple different ways, but it's easiest to picture it as an arrow. The direction it's pointing in is obviously the direction that the player is moving, and its length is how much we're moving every frame. So that's basically just distance over time, which is speed. Right now, we're just setting this arrow to a predetermined value depending on what buttons are pressed. For example, if I hold D, it goes this way, and if I hold A, it goes this way. But as a reminder, we want the player to accelerate up to this speed, not just immediately be at it once you press the button. So we can use a function called moveToward to move the player's velocity vector towards a max speed value by an acceleration value every frame, and then do the same thing but in reverse when they're not holding the button. And now we have a controller that feels a lot more fluid without that much more work. Outside of player controls, level design is probably the most important part of platformers, because you can't just put Mario in a Sonic level or Sonic in a Mario level, right? Sonic would just be running into walls and shit, and Mario would take like 20 minutes to get to the end of a level, because Sonic's entire identity throughout the franchise has been focused on speed and fluidity. And the best Sonic levels are ones where the player doesn't even really have to think to get to the end. They can just sort of follow their instincts and blast through whatever's in their way. Mario, on the other hand, takes things much more slowly for the most part. There can be fast moments or extra challenging levels, but for the most part it should feel like a leisurely yet adventurous stroll through a whimsical kingdom. So making sure that the levels fit with the player controller's movement mechanics is also a really important aspect of platformers. There's also a lot of different kinds of platforming challenges. Like I said, Sonic is mainly focused on speed, while Mario generally feels more relaxed and adventurous, but there's also games that focus on things like consistency, precision, technical skill, or a combination of any of those things. You can also have all of those things within the same game. Like I said before, how successful each of these types of levels are depends a lot on the player's movement mechanics. For example, Sonic wouldn't really work great with precision, but something like Mario could work pretty well in any of these types of levels, which is why they made 2 games where anyone could make a Mario level. Now, does this completely conflict with what I just said like 20 seconds ago in the last paragraph? A little bit, but not really, because like, look at this. You wouldn't expect this to be a level that appears in an actual mainline Mario game. Like, this is insane, okay? Mario Maker is not really a mainline Mario game, and community-made levels are not going to be the same as mainline levels. Okay, it's a spin-off, it doesn't count. They can still be good levels, but they serve a different purpose than traditional levels do. Mainline flagship IP games are usually intended to appeal to a general audience, and Mario Maker as a whole appeals to that audience, but there are also specific niches within that audience which these levels are made for. Another thing that's really nice about platformers is how many established tropes there are. This is what makes a platformer really good as a beginner game dev project. Bounce pads, enemies that you have to jump on to kill, spike pits, falling spikes, and power-ups, all of which, except for power-ups, I put in my first game. Objectively speaking, this was not a very good game. It's a generic platformer filled with tropes that has 5 levels, and there's just not a lot going on. But I knew that at the time. Obviously, your first game isn't going to be very good, especially if you're a solo developer. So it's best to just take it as a learning experience, see what you enjoy, what you're good at, and if it's even worth doing in the first place. When I first started game dev, I mainly thought I was going to be a 3D artist and animator. But then when I was working on this game, I programmed a system where a player has to push a button to unlock a door, which is like the easiest thing in the world. But when I did that, I realized I like programming systems and mechanics more than I like making 3D models and animations. So now I mainly do that. In conclusion, platformers, despite arguably being the simplest kind of game that there is, can actually have a lot of depth and serve really well as a beginner game dev project. As always, thank you for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.